Make my daughter speak, and I'll give you $2 million, the Mafia boss whispered. Not threatened. His voice was shaking. The maid didn't flinch. She simply knelt beside the silent little girl everyone in the city feared to even look at. Why did the most dangerous man alive look terrified? Of his own child. And why did the maid look like she already knew the answer? Before we dive right in, please subscribe, like, and share the video. You are going to really enjoy the story, but the interesting fact is that tomorrow's story is going to be more thrilling, and if you don't subscribe, you might not see us again. Your support means a lot to us. The autumn light filtered weakly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wallace mansion when Amber Robinson walked through the servants' entrance for the first time. The grand estate loomed before her, all marble columns and imported chandeliers, but something about the house felt hollow, like a museum built to hold ghosts. Steve Wallace sat in the East Wing sitting room, his 6-year-old daughter Mitchell perched beside him on a velvet sofa that cost more than most people's cars. The child wore a pristine white dress with delicate lace trim, her dark hair brushed to perfection, but her eyes, those haunted brown eyes, stared at nothing at all. She hadn't spoken a word since the night her mother died. 2 years of absolute silence. And Steve had tried everything. Child psychologist from Johns Hopkins, trauma specialist flown in from Switzerland, art therapy, music therapy, even a renowned speech pathologist who'd worked miracles with selective mutism cases. But Mitchell remained locked behind walls that money couldn't breach, her voice buried somewhere deep beneath the rubble of that terrible night. The mansion staff moved through the halls like shadows, careful, quiet, afraid. Nobody looked the Mafia boss directly in the eye. Nobody dared speak to his daughter anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because her silence had become a mirror that reflected back their own helplessness. Then Amber entered the sitting room. Mrs. Dawson, the head housekeeper, had been explaining the cleaning schedule in hushed tones, but Amber's attention had already shifted. She noticed them immediately. Maybe it was the way Steve's perfectly tailored suit couldn't hide the slope of exhaustion in his shoulders, or how the little girl sat so unnaturally still, like a porcelain doll someone had forgotten to wind up. She'd been working odd jobs for 15 years, moving from house to house, but something about this pair tugged at something dormant in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. "That's Mr. Wallace and his daughter," Mrs. Dawson whispered. "You'll clean the East Wing, but best not to disturb them. The child, well, she doesn't speak to anyone." Amber nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on Mitchell. There was protocol, of course, invisible staff, quiet efficiency, but as Amber crossed the Persian rug to adjust the curtains, she did something no one had done in months. She stopped, turned, and knelt down to the child's eye level, not hovering above her, not treating her like a problem to solve, just present. "Hello," Amber said softly, offering the smallest of smiles. "I'm Amber." Mitchell's silence filled the space between them, like water in a well, deep, still, and impossibly heavy. But for just a heartbeat, the girl's gaze shifted. Her eyes met Amber's. Steve watched from his position on the sofa, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Something flickered across his face. Surprise? Hope? He'd seen 100 professionals try to reach his daughter with their advanced techniques and 5-syllable diagnoses. None of them had simply knelt. When Amber stood and moved to continue her work, Steve caught fragments of his own thoughts, the ones that haunted him every night. 3 psychiatrists, 2 years, millions of dollars, and my baby girl is still alone in there. That evening, as Amber prepared to leave for the day, Steve called her to the study. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who'd run out of options and was staring down the barrel of forever. "You're the new maid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment, this quiet woman with calm eyes and careful hands, who'd done something in 5 minutes that entire teams of experts had failed to do in 2 years. Make his daughter see someone. "My daughter hasn't spoken since her mother was killed." The words came out like gravel. "The best doctors in the world have tried. Nothing works." Amber stood very still, her fingers clasped in front of her uniform. Steve's jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice cracked just slightly, a fracture in the armor. "Make my daughter speak, and I'll give you $2 million. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with desperation and power, and the weight of a father's breaking heart. Amber looked up then, and her eyes held something Steve hadn't seen in his world for a very long time: compassion without calculation. "What if she doesn't need money, Mr. Wallace?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the study like a bell. "What if she just needs to feel safe?" The Mafia boss, the man who commanded fear across 3 states, who'd built an empire on control and power, had no response. Because for the first time in 2 years, someone had suggested that the answer might not be something he could buy. As Amber left the study, she glanced back toward the sitting room, where Mitchell still sat in the dimming light. The child's small fingers were tracing the embroidered pattern on the sofa cushion, around and around in endless circles. And in the fishbowl on the side table, a single goldfish swam lazy loops, catching Mitchell's distant gaze. There was something in the girl's expression, something that looked almost like curiosity, almost like the first crack in a wall that had stood for far too long. But Amber Robinson knew something Steve Wallace didn't. She understood that silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes it was full of things too terrible to speak aloud. Because she, too, had lost someone to violence. And she carried her own secrets through the halls of the Wallace mansion. Secrets that, if revealed, would change everything. The mansion was beautiful the way a mausoleum is beautiful: cold marble, perfect symmetry, and the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums until they ached. Amber learned the rules quickly. Mrs. Dawson laid them out in clipped, efficient sentences during her second morning. East wing by 8 a.m., west wing by noon. Mr. Wallace's study is off limits unless he summons you. And the child's room. She paused, her voice dropping. Clean it while she's at breakfast. She doesn't like people watching her. The other staff whispered when they thought Amber couldn't hear. Poor thing hasn't said a word since the night Mrs. Wallace was shot. Right in front of her, they say. Blood everywhere. Mr. Wallace blames himself, keeps trying to fix her with money. Therapists, specialists, nothing works. You can't buy back a voice stolen by trauma. Amber said nothing. She just listened, dusted, and observed. And what she saw broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Steve Wallace moved through his own home like a ghost haunting the scene of his greatest failure. He spoke in low tones on business calls, his commands sharp and unyielding. But when Mitchell entered the room, his entire body tensed. One afternoon, Amber watched from the hallway as he approached his daughter in the library. Mitchell sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, surrounded by untouched dolls and storybooks. Mitchell, sweetheart, Steve said softly, kneeling a few feet away. Do you want to read together? He reached out, just a gentle movement, but Mitchell flinched. She pulled her knees to her chest and turned her face toward the window. Steve's hand froze midair, his jaw tightened. Then he stood, straightened his suit jacket, and walked out without a word. But Amber saw the way his shoulders shook as he passed her in the hall. The world feared Steve Wallace. His own daughter couldn't bear his touch. Amber began to notice patterns the others had missed, or perhaps they'd stopped looking. Mitchell avoided the darkened corners of rooms, always positioning herself near windows or lamps. When someone dropped a tray in the kitchen, the sharp clang echoing through the halls, the girl froze completely. Her small body rigid, eyes wide and unseeing. And at night, when Amber passed Mitchell's bedroom, she saw the glow beneath the door. Every light in the room blazing. The girl never slept in darkness. She's not broken, Amber thought. She's terrified. So Amber did what no therapist had thought to do. She didn't try to fix Mitchell. She just existed beside her. It started with small things. A folded paper crane left on the breakfast table where Mitchell ate alone. A soft stuffed bunny placed on the window seat in the library, right where the sunlight pooled warmest. A music box that played gentle melodies set on the dresser in the girls' room. Amber never drew attention to these gifts, never waited for acknowledgement. She simply left them and moved on with her work. But she noticed when the paper crane disappeared from the table, when the bunny was tucked under Mitchell's arm during afternoon reading time, when the music box was wound up and playing softly through the crack beneath the door. Steve noticed too. He found Amber one evening in the East Wing, humming softly as she folded linens. Mitchell sat nearby on the window seat, the stuffed bunny in her lap, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "What are you doing?" Steve's voice was quiet, almost cautious. Amber looked up, meeting his gaze steadily. "Folding sheets, Mr. Wallace." "That's not what I mean." He gestured toward Mitchell. "Those things you leave for her, the toys, the cranes. Why?" Amber set down the linen, choosing her words carefully. "Because maybe she doesn't need someone to make her talk, sir. Maybe she just needs to know she's not alone." Steve stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes shifted to his daughter, who for the first time in weeks looked almost peaceful. The specialist said not to coddle her, said it would make the trauma worse. "Respectfully, Mr. Wallace," Amber said gently, "sometimes what looks like coddling is just called being kind." For a long moment, Steve said nothing. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. But the next morning, Amber found a box on her workstation. Inside were packages of origami paper, dozens of sheets in every color imaginable. No note, no explanation, just paper. And when she glanced up, she saw Steve watching from the study doorway, his expression carefully blank. Then he closed the door. What would you do if kindness was the only weapon you had against a child's silence? Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the heaviest hope. Amber Robinson understood something that all the highly paid specialists had missed. Healing doesn't happen on a schedule. So she stopped trying to make Mitchell speak. Instead, she simply was. In the mornings, while dusting the crown molding in the sitting room, Amber hummed old lullabies her grandmother had sung to her. Melodies without words, just gentle rises and falls that filled the silence without demanding anything in return. The first time she did it, Mitchell's head turned slightly from where she sat with her untouched breakfast. Just a fraction of movement. But Amber noticed. She kept humming, her hands moving in slow, rhythmic circles across the mahogany furniture. The sound wrapped around the room like a soft blanket, and for those few minutes, the mansion didn't feel quite so haunted. One afternoon, Amber found Mitchell standing in the sunroom, staring at the garden through the glass. Rain streaked down the windows, distorting the roses into watercolor smears. Amber didn't ask what she was thinking, didn't try to coax conversation. Instead, she pulled a small tin of crayons from her apron pocket, the kind she'd bought from the dollar store on her day off, and set them on the window ledge beside a pad of paper. "Sometimes I like to draw when it rains," Amber said quietly, not looking at the girl directly. "The colors look brighter somehow." She moved to straighten the curtains, giving Mitchell space to decide. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Amber heard it, the soft scratch of crayon against paper. She didn't turn around, didn't comment, just continued her work, her heart beating a little faster. When she left the room 20 minutes later, Mitchell was still drawing, her small fingers wrapped around a blue crayon, her expression focused and calm. Amber developed a rhythm, a quiet dance of presence and patience. She sat in the library while Mitchell looked at picture books, neither of them speaking, just existing in the same space. She folded origami birds at the kitchen table during her breaks, her fingers creating delicate wings and pointed beaks. Sometimes Mitchell would wander in and watch from the doorway. Amber would smile but never invite her closer. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Mitchell began to migrate toward her. First, she'd sit 3 chairs away at the table, then 2, then 1. Until one evening, Mitchell climbed into the chair directly beside Amber and watched the paper transform beneath her hands. Amber's fingers trembled slightly as she folded the final crease, but her voice remained steady. "Would you like to try?" Mitchell didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. Amber slid a square of yellow paper across the table. Together in silence they folded. It happened on a Tuesday. Amber was organizing the East Wing playroom, a space filled with expensive toys that looked barely touched, preserved in the same positions they'd held for 2 years. She heard soft footsteps behind her but didn't turn. She'd learned that direct attention sometimes made Mitchell retreat. Then something brushed against her hand, a piece of paper. Amber looked down at the drawing Mitchell was offering her. The crayon lines were simple, childlike, but the image was unmistakable. two stick figures standing side by side. One tall with dark curly hair, wearing what looked like an apron. One small with a triangle dress. Their hands were joined by a thick blue line. Beneath them, in careful, shaky letters, friends. Amber's breath caught. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Not now, not when Mitchell was watching her with those searching brown eyes. "This is beautiful," Amber whispered, her voice thick. "May I keep it?" Mitchell nodded once. Then, for the first time since Amber had arrived, the smallest hint of a smile ghosted across the girl's face. It lasted barely a second, but it was there. Steve Wallace hadn't meant to see it. He'd been walking past the playroom on his way to his study when he caught sight of them through the partially open door. Amber kneeling on the carpet, holding the drawing with reverent care, and Mitchell standing close enough to touch her, close enough to trust. His daughter, who flinched away from him, was choosing to be near someone. Steve's hand gripped the doorframe, his knuckles white. His chest felt too tight, like something was expanding inside it that he didn't have room for. He watched as Amber carefully folded the drawing and tucked it into her apron pocket, right over her heart. Watched as she said something he couldn't hear that made Mitchell's eyes brighten just slightly. And Steve realized, with a feeling that was equal parts grief and hope, that this was the first real sign of connection his daughter had shown in 2 years. Not because of doctors or medicine or money, but because someone had simply chosen to sit beside her in the silence and wait. That evening, Steve found the drawing. Amber had pinned it to the small bulletin board in the servants' quarters, right in the center, like a masterpiece in a gallery. He stood there for a long time, staring at those two stick figures holding hands. And for the first time since his wife's death, Steve Wallace allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his daughter could find her way back. Not to who she was before, but to who she might become. Steve Wallace had built an empire on reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were hiding something, when they were dangerous. And Amber Robinson was hiding something. He saw it in the way her hands stilled sometimes when she thought no one was watching. In the faraway look that crossed her face when sirens wailed past the mansion gates. In the careful way she chose her words, as if each sentence was a minefield she had to navigate. Steve had survived this long by trusting his instincts. And his instincts told him that Amber's kindness came from a place deeper than simple compassion. It came from understanding. It was late afternoon when he heard it. Steve had been working in his study, reviewing accounts that needed his signature, when a sound drifted through the partially open door. A voice, soft and melodic, singing. He recognized the melody instantly. His pen froze mid-signature. "Hush now, my darling, the stars watch above." That song. Catherine used to sing it to Mitchell every night before bed, her voice gentle and sure, as she rocked their daughter in the antique chair by the window. "Sleep now, my precious, wrapped safe in my love." Steve's throat tightened. He hadn't heard those words in 2 years, hadn't been able to bear hearing them. He stood, moving toward the sound like a man in a trance. Amber stood in the hallway outside Mitchell's room, folding fresh linens from the cart. She sang quietly, almost unconsciously, as she worked, the lullaby flowing from her lips as naturally as breathing. Mitchell sat on the floor nearby, building a tower with blocks, and for once she looked peaceful. "Morning will find you, the darkness will fade." "Where did you learn that song?" Amber's hands jerked, the sheet slipping from her fingers. She turned to find Steve standing at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp, searching. "Mr. Wallace, Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "That song," he repeated, moving closer. "Where did you learn it?" The air between them felt heavy, charged with something Amber couldn't name. Her mind raced. She could lie, make up some story about hearing it on the radio, learning it in school. But something in his eyes told her he would know. And she was so tired of carrying secrets. "My mother," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She used to sing it to my little brother." Steve's jaw tightened. "Used to?" Amber's hands clasped together, her knuckles white. She hadn't spoken about this in years, had buried it so deep she sometimes pretended it hadn't happened at all. But standing here in this mansion haunted by loss, with this man who understood what it meant to watch violence steal someone you loved. The wall cracked. He was 7, Amber said, her voice trembling. His name was Marcus. He had this laugh that... She stopped, swallowed hard. He could light up a whole room. Steve waited, silent. 5 years ago, there was a fight, gang territory dispute in our neighborhood. Bullets started flying. Her eyes closed. Marcus was walking home from the corner store. Wrong place, wrong time. The words hung in the air like smoke. He died on the sidewalk before the ambulance came. My mother held him and sang that song over and over, like if she just kept singing, he'd wake up. Steve's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. I'm sorry, Bezao, he said, and it sounded genuine, rawer than she'd expected from a man like him. Amber opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly. What she didn't say, what she would never say, was that she'd seen the investigation reports, had recognized the names involved in that gang dispute, recognized the organization that controlled that territory, recognized the man who gave the orders. She was standing in his house, working for him, helping his daughter heal from the same kind of violence that had shattered her own family. The irony was almost unbearable, but she'd made her choice the moment she accepted this position because Mitchell was innocent. And maybe, just maybe, helping her was a way to honor Marcus's memory instead of drowning in bitterness. So you understand, Steve said quietly. It wasn't a question. Understand what? Amber asked, though she knew. What it's like to lose someone to violence, to watch the light go out of someone's eyes and know you can never get it back. Amber's throat ached. Yes, I understand. For a long moment they stood in the hallway, two people bound by grief, separated by secrets. Steve's voice dropped lower. Is that why you're so patient with Mitchell? Because you know what it's like to be broken? I'm patient with Mitchell, Amber said softly, because she deserves someone who won't give up on her, no matter how long it takes. Something flickered across Steve's face. Guilt, maybe, or shame. He nodded once, then turned to leave. But he paused at the end of the hallway. The people responsible for your brother, he said without turning around. Did they ever face justice? Amber's heart hammered against her ribs. No, she whispered. They never did. Steve's shoulders tensed. Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing through the mansion like a drumbeat. That night, Amber stood at her small window in the servants' quarters, staring out at the manicured gardens bathed in moonlight. She'd told the truth, but not all of it. And the weight of what remained unsaid pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. What would you do if forgiveness meant standing in the house of the man whose world took everything from you? Somewhere in the mansion, a music box played softly, the one she'd given Mitchell. Amber closed her eyes and let the melody wash over her. Tomorrow she would fold more paper cranes. Tomorrow she would keep singing lullabies. Tomorrow she would choose love over vengeance. Again. Change came slowly to the Wallace mansion, so gradually that at first no one was quite sure it was happening at all. But it was. Steve Wallace had ruled his empire with an iron voice. Commands delivered in clipped tones that left no room for negotiation, phone calls that made grown men flinch on the other end of the line. But something was shifting. Mrs. Dawson noticed it first during the morning briefing when Steve reviewed the household schedule. The florist will arrive at 2, she said, checking her clipboard, and the landscapers need approval for... That's fine, Steve said quietly, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. Just keep the noise down near the east wing. Mitchell naps around that time. Mrs. Dawson blinked. In 5 years of service, she'd never heard him speak that softly. Of course, sir. He started appearing in rooms where Mitchell spent her time. Not hovering, not demanding, just present. One morning, Amber found him sitting in the library, a newspaper folded in his lap, while Mitchell colored at the low table across the room. He wasn't reading, his eyes tracked his daughter's movements with the careful attention of someone learning a new language. When Mitchell reached for a green crayon, Steve shifted forward slightly as if to help. But he stopped himself. Amber watched from the doorway as he settled back into his chair, letting his daughter solve the problem on her own. It was such a small thing, but it was everything. Ms. Robinson, could you... Amber. She turned from the window she'd been cleaning to find Steve standing in the doorway of the sitting room, his hands tucked into his pockets. Sir. You should call me Steve, he said, then corrected himself. I mean, you don't have to, but he trailed off, looking oddly uncomfortable for a man who commanded criminal empires. And I'll call you Amber, if that's all right. Something warm unfurled in Amber's chest. That's all right, she said softly. He nodded once, then walked away, but not before she caught the hint of relief in his expression. The staff noticed. Cook mentioned it first, while preparing lunch in the industrial kitchen. He said please to me this morning, she whispered to Mrs. Dawson. Actually said please when asking for his coffee. He's been spending more time with the girl, Mrs. Dawson replied, dicing vegetables with practiced efficiency. Actually sitting with her at breakfast instead of just leaving her with the nanny. And did you see him yesterday? The groundskeeper had wandered in for his afternoon tea. He was out in the garden, just watching her play, not on his phone, not barking orders, just watching. They exchanged glances. The boss is different now, Cook said finally. It's the maid, Mrs. Dawson said, her voice thoughtful. Amber, something about her. She's gentle, the groundskeeper offered. Patient. Maybe that's rubbing off on him. Or maybe, Mrs. Dawson said quietly, he's finally learning what his daughter needed all along. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in the garden. The autumn sun filtered through the oak trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Mitchell sat on a stone bench while Amber knelt behind her, carefully sectioning her dark hair into 3 parts. Would you like a braid today? Amber asked softly. Or 2 braids? Mitchell held up 2 fingers. 2 it is. Amber's fingers worked gently, weaving the strands together with the kind of care that couldn't be rushed. She hummed while she worked, a different tune this time, something lighter. And then Mitchell did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She laughed. It was barely more than a breath, a soft, surprised giggle when a butterfly landed on her knee, its orange wings opening and closing like a heartbeat. But it was real. Amber's hands stilled for just a moment, her own breath catching. Well, hello there, little friend, she whispered, watching the butterfly with Mitchell. The girl's shoulders shook with another small laugh, this one slightly louder, more certain. Steve had been reviewing contracts in his study when he heard it through the open window. That sound, that impossible, miraculous sound. He stood so quickly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor, crossed to the window, and looked down at the garden below. There was Mitchell, her face tilted toward the sun, her eyes bright with wonder as the butterfly took flight. And there was Amber, her hands gentle in his daughter's hair, her expression radiant with quiet joy. And his daughter was laughing. Steve's throat tightened. His hand gripped the windowsill until his knuckles went white. Something shifted in his chest. Something that had been frozen solid for 2 years, cracking like ice under spring sun. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Steve Wallace didn't smile. Hadn't smiled since Catherine died. But it was close. So close. That evening he found Amber in the hallway. Thank you, he said simply. Amber looked up from the linens she was organizing. For what, sir? She caught herself. Steve. He gestured vaguely toward the garden, toward his daughter's room, toward everything Amber had quietly, persistently changed. For giving her back pieces of herself I thought were gone forever. Amber's eyes softened. She was never gone. She was just waiting to feel safe enough to come back. Steve nodded slowly, processing this. You're good at this, he said. At seeing people. Really seeing them. So are you, Amber replied gently. You're learning. And for the first time in 2 years, Steve Wallace felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. When was the last time you witnessed someone break down their own walls just to build a bridge to another person's heart? In the garden below, a paper crane sat on the stone bench where Mitchell had left it. A small white bird with carefully folded wings, waiting to take flight. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the night was still. Just the usual silence that filled the Wallace mansion after dark. The next, thunder cracked across the sky like a whip, so loud the windows rattled in their frames. Amber jolted awake in her small room in the servants' quarters, her heart hammering. Then she heard it. Not thunder this time. A scream, high, terrified, and achingly familiar. Mitchell. Amber threw off her blanket and ran, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. She didn't bother with a robe over her nightgown, didn't stop to turn on lights. Another crack of thunder shook the mansion. Lightning flooded the hallways in stark white flashes, turning everything into a nightmare landscape of shadows and two bright edges. By the time Amber reached the east wing, Steve was already there. He stood in the center of Mitchell's room, still in his dress shirt and slacks from earlier, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it for hours. "Mitchell, sweetheart, please." His voice was desperate, breaking. "Come out. It's just a storm. You're safe, I promise you're safe." But Mitchell wasn't listening. She'd wedged herself under the antique writing desk in the corner, her small body curled into the tightest ball possible. Her hands covered her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, her whole frame shaking. Silent sobs racked her shoulders. Thunder boomed again, a sound like explosions, like gunfire echoing through a parking garage, like the night everything shattered. Steve took a step toward her. "Baby, please, it's just noise. It can't hurt you." He reached for her. Mitchell's eyes flew open, wild with terror, and she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall, a wounded animal cornered and convinced every touch meant pain. Steve froze, the color drained from his face. His hand hung suspended in the air, trembling. His voice cracked completely. "I don't know what to do." For the first time since Amber had met him, Steve Wallace looked exactly like what he was beneath the power and the money and the carefully constructed armor. A broken father who couldn't save his own child. "Steve." Amber's voice was soft but clear. She stepped into the room, her presence calm despite the chaos outside. He turned to her and the desperation in his eyes nearly broke her. "I can't reach her," he whispered. "She's terrified of me." "No," Amber said gently. "She's terrified of losing someone again. There's a difference." Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in harsh white. Thunder followed, closer this time, a rolling crash that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mansion. Mitchell whimpered, a sound so small and hurt it cut through the storm. Amber moved. She crossed the room slowly, carefully, then knelt on the floor beside the desk. Not reaching, not crowding, just there. "Mitchell, sweetheart," Amber said, her voice steady and warm despite the storm raging outside. "Look at me." The girl's eyes remained squeezed shut. "It's Amber. I'm right here." Another flash of lightning painted the room white. Thunder cracked. And in that moment, Mitchell's eyes opened, finding Amber's face in the chaos. "The thunder can't hurt you," Amber continued, her tone never wavering. "It's just sound, loud sound, scary sound, but it's not the same as that night. Do you hear me? You're safe now." She extended her hand, palm up, offering, never forcing. "You're safe, sweet girl, I promise." Lightning split the sky. Thunder followed, shaking the windows. And Mitchell gasped, a sharp, broken inhale, and grabbed Amber's hand, her small fingers wrapped around Amber's with desperate strength, her whole body trembling. Then, for the first time in 2 years, Mitchell Wallace spoke. "Mommy." The word was barely more than a whisper, cracked and uncertain, like something fragile being pulled from deep underwater. But it was a word, a voice, a miracle. Steve made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp. His legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees on the plush carpet, his hands covering his face as tears, hot and unstoppable, poured through his fingers. He wept the way he hadn't allowed himself to weep since Catherine's funeral. Great, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief, somewhere close to his soul. "Oh God," he choked out. "Oh God, baby." Amber pulled Mitchell into her arms, cradling the shaking child against her chest. "I know, sweetheart," she murmured into the girl's hair. "I know you miss her. I know it hurts." Mitchell clung to her, still trembling, still terrified, but speaking. "Mommy's gone," the small voice whispered. "Yes," Amber said softly, honestly. "She is, and that's the hardest thing in the world." Another flash of lightning. But this time, Mitchell didn't scream. She just pressed closer to Amber's warmth and whispered again. "Scared." "I know you are," Amber said, "but you're not alone. Not anymore." Steve crawled forward on his knees, moving slowly, carefully, giving Mitchell every chance to pull away. But this time, she didn't flinch. She turned her head and looked at him, really looked at him, with those big brown eyes still swimming with tears. Daddy, she whispered. And Steve Wallace shattered completely. He pulled both of them into his arms, his daughter and the woman who'd given her back her voice, and held them while the storm raged outside and something fundamental shifted inside the walls of the haunted mansion. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment a heart remembers how to beat again? Outside, rain hammered against the windows. Inside, for the first time in 2 years, there was more than silence. There was hope. There was healing. There was love. Morning came quietly to the Wallace mansion. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting the marble floors in shades of gold. But Steve Wallace hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in Mitchell's room, sitting in the chair by her bed, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time in 2 years. No nightmares, no thrashing, just the steady rise and fall of her small chest, one hand curled around the stuffed bunny Amber had given her. His daughter had spoken. 3 words that had shattered and rebuilt him in the span of a single breath. And it was because of Amber. At 8 o'clock, Steve found Mrs. Dawson in the kitchen. "Ask Amber to come to my study," he said, his voice hoarse from crying. "Please." Mrs. Dawson's eyes widened slightly at the please, but she nodded. "Of course, sir." 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on the study door. "Come in." Amber entered, still in her maid's uniform, her hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. She looked tired. She'd stayed with Mitchell until nearly 3 in the morning, singing lullabies until the girl finally drifted off. "You wanted to see me?" Steve stood behind his massive oak desk, his hands braced against the polished surface like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Sit," he said, then caught himself. "Please, sit down." Amber settled into one of the leather chairs across from him, her hands folded carefully in her lap. For a long moment, Steve just looked at her. This woman who'd walked into his home 6 weeks ago and changed everything without ever raising her voice or demanding recognition. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice rough. Amber waited, patient as always. "Last night," he stopped, swallowed hard. "What you did for Mitchell, what you've been doing for her, I don't have words for what that means to me." "She's a beautiful child," Amber said softly. "She just needed someone to see that." "No," Steve shook his head. "It's more than that. The best doctors in the world tried to help her. Specialists, therapists, people with degrees and credentials and decades of experience." His jaw tightened, and they all failed. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a leather checkbook. "But you didn't fail. You made my daughter speak again." Amber's expression remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes. Steve's hand trembled slightly as he wrote, the pen scratching across the paper with careful deliberation. When he finished, he tore the check free and set it on the desk between them. $2 million, he said, his voice breaking on the numbers. "That's what I promised you. Make my daughter speak, and it's yours." He slid the check across the desk toward her. "You earned every penny." Amber looked down at the check. $2 million. More money than she'd see in 10 lifetimes of cleaning houses and folding linens. Enough to change everything, to leave this life behind, to start fresh somewhere far away from the violence and memories that haunted her. Enough to matter. Steve watched her, waiting for the gratitude, the tears of joy, the overwhelming relief that came when someone's life was transformed by his generosity. He'd given large sums before, always to people who served him well, who proved their worth. It felt right. It felt like justice. It felt like the only way he knew how to show appreciation. But Amber didn't pick up the check. She didn't even touch it. She just looked at it for a long moment, then lifted her eyes to meet his. "I didn't do it for the money, Steve." Her voice was quiet, steady, and absolutely certain. Steve blinked. "What?" "I didn't help Mitchell because you offered me money," Amber continued. "I did it because she's a little girl who's been hurting, and she needed someone to love her through it." She stood slowly, leaving the check untouched on the desk. "Money can't buy what she needed, and it can't repay what I gave her. Because what I gave her wasn't a service, it was care. It was compassion." Steve stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "But I owe you." "You don't owe me anything." Amber said gently. Your daughter is speaking again. She's healing. That's all the payment I need. For the first time in his adult life, Steve Wallace was completely speechless. People didn't refuse him. They didn't turn down his offers, didn't reject his generosity, didn't walk away from life-changing money. They couldn't. But Amber was. I don't understand, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Everyone wants something. Everyone has a price. Amber's expression softened with something that looked almost like pity. Maybe that's the world you've lived in, she said. But it's not the world I want to live in. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Mitchell doesn't need more things, Steve. She doesn't need expensive toys, or fancy therapists, or grand gestures. Amber turned back to look at him. She needs you. Present, patient, loving her without trying to fix everything with money. The words hit Steve like physical blows. You have everything you need to help her heal, Amber continued. You just have to choose to show up every day, even when it's hard. She opened the door, especially when it's hard. When she was gone, Steve sank into his chair, staring at the check still lying on his desk. $2 million. Refused. He'd built his entire empire on the belief that everyone could be bought, that everything had a price, that money was power and power was everything. And this woman, this quiet maid with gentle hands and a voice like comfort, had just proven him wrong. She'd shattered his entire worldview with 7 words. I didn't do it for the money. Steve picked up the check with shaking hands. Then slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half, then in half again, and again, until $2 million was nothing but confetti scattered across his desk. What would it cost you to realize that the most valuable things in life can't be bought? Outside the study window, Mitchell's laughter drifted up from the garden, clear and bright and impossibly precious. And Steve Wallace, the man who'd always believed money could solve everything, finally understood what true wealth looked like. It looked like love, freely given. It looked like Amber. The change didn't happen all at once, but it happened. 3 days after the storm, Steve found Mitchell in the library, building a tower with blocks. Instead of watching from the doorway like he used to, he crossed the room and lowered himself onto the carpet beside her. Can I help? He asked quietly. Mitchell looked at him with those searching brown eyes, considering. Then she handed him a blue block. Steve's hand trembled as he took it. He placed it carefully on the tower, holding his breath, waiting for her to pull away or retreat back into silence. But she didn't. She just picked up a red block and added it to the top. They built together in silence. Not the heavy, suffocating silence that had filled the mansion for 2 years, but something softer, something almost peaceful. When the tower finally toppled, Mitchell's small giggle filled the air. And Steve laughed too, a rusty, uncertain sound, like he'd forgotten how. But it was real. That afternoon, he made a phone call. Marcus, Steve said when his lawyer answered, I need you to set up a trust fund, $50 million, for Mitchell. Of course, Marcus replied, already taking notes. Standard terms? No, Steve's voice was firm. I want it structured so she can access it when she turns 25. For education, business ventures, whatever she chooses. But nothing, he paused, nothing connected to the family business. Do you understand? There was a beat of surprised silence on the other end. You want to separate her inheritance from your operations? Completely, Steve said. I want her to have a choice, a clean choice, the kind I never had. Another pause. Consider it done. When Steve hung up, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, relief. His daughter would have a future that wasn't built on violence and fear. Even if he couldn't escape his own past, he could give her a different path. The following week, Steve began making other calls. Tell Marino the shipment is off. Permanently. We're pulling out of the territory disputes in the West Side. I don't care what it costs. No more weapons shipments. Find another business. His associates were confused, concerned. Some were angry, but Steve didn't waver. He'd spent 20 years building an empire on blood and intimidation. And what had it gotten him? Money, yes. Power, certainly. But it had cost him his wife. It had nearly cost him his daughter. Some prices were too high to pay. One evening, Amber found him standing in Mitchell's doorway, watching as the girl slept peacefully, the music box playing its gentle melody on the nightstand. "You're doing well with her," Amber said softly, coming to stand beside him. Steve's jaw tightened. "I don't know if I am. I keep waiting to mess it up, to say the wrong thing or move too fast or—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Love someone without trying to control everything about their world." His voice was raw. "My whole life, I've stayed alive by maintaining control. Every situation, every person, every outcome. But with Mitchell," he trailed off, struggling, "I can't control her healing. Can't force her to trust me. Can't buy her happiness or command her affection." He looked at Amber, and his expression was almost pleading. "So, what do I do?" Amber was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "You already know what to do," she said finally. "You've been doing it for weeks now." "Failing?" "Showing up," Amber corrected gently. "Sitting with her, building towers, reading books together, being present even when it's uncomfortable." Steve's hands clenched at his sides. "But I need to do something, fix something, make it better somehow." "You are making it better, just by being here, just by trying." "That doesn't feel like enough." "Maybe that's because you've spent your whole life believing love has to be earned or proven or purchased," Amber said softly. "But love isn't control, Steve." He turned to look at her fully. "Then what is it?" Amber's eyes were gentle but unflinching. "It's trust," she said. "Trusting that sometimes the best thing you can do is just be there. No fixing, no controlling, just present, patient, constant." Steve stood very still, letting those words sink into places he'd kept armored for decades. Trust, the very thing he'd built his empire by never giving. "What if I'm not good at that?" he asked quietly. "You're learning," Amber replied. "That's what matters." She started to walk away, but Steve's voice stopped her. "Amber?" She turned. "Thank you," he said, "not just for Mitchell, for this, for showing me that there's another way." Something warm flickered in her expression. "You're welcome." The next morning, Steve woke early and went to Mitchell's room. She was already awake, sitting by the window with a picture book in her lap. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly. "Morning, Daddy," she replied, those two words still a miracle he'd never take for granted. "Want to have breakfast together? Just you and me?" Mitchell considered this, then nodded. They went down to the kitchen, not the formal dining room, but the actual kitchen where Cook was already preparing the day's meals. Steve lifted Mitchell onto one of the high stools at the counter, then sat beside his stomach. "What would you like?" he asked. "Pancakes," she said quietly. "Pancakes it is." They sat together while Cook made breakfast, and Steve didn't check his phone once. Didn't bark orders or review contracts. He just sat with his daughter, listening to her quiet observations about the birds outside the window, about the book she was reading, about nothing and everything. And he realized something profound. This was what he'd been missing all along. Not control, not power, just this, just being a father. Later, when Amber passed by the kitchen, she saw them, Steve listening intently as Mitchell explained something with animated hand gestures, his full attention on her like she was the most important person in the world. Because she was. And for the first time since she'd arrived at the Wallace mansion, Amber saw what Steve Wallace could become. Not a mafia boss, not a feared criminal, just a man learning to love without conditions. Just a father, finally coming home. When was the last time you realized that the thing you've been trying to control is exactly what you need to surrender? In the garden, paper cranes swayed in the morning breeze. Dozens of them now, hung from tree branches like prayers made visible. And somewhere in the mansion, music played softly, the sound of healing, the sound of hope, the sound of love, freely given and finally received. 6 weeks had passed since the storm. 6 weeks of Mitchell's voice growing stronger, clearer, more confident with each passing day. 6 weeks of Steve learning to be a father instead of a fixer. 6 weeks of the Wallace mansion slowly transforming from a mausoleum into something that almost resembled a home. And now Amber's suitcase sat at the bottom of the grand staircase. She'd made the decision 3 days earlier, standing in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the simple life she'd built within these walls. Mitchell was speaking now, laughing, healing. Steve had learned to sit with his daughter without trying to control her world. Her work here was done, and staying any longer felt dangerous, not because of Steve's world, but because of how much she'd come to care, how deeply she'd woven herself into the fabric of this broken family. It was time to leave before the lines blurred any further, before her heart forgot why she'd come in the first place. Mrs. Dawson had cried when Amber told her. "You're sure?" the head housekeeper had asked, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "The girl adores you, Mr. Wallace. Well, I've never seen him like this. Peaceful, almost." "That's exactly why I need to go," Amber had said softly. "They don't need me anymore. They need each other." But now, standing in the foyer with her worn suitcase and a cardboard box of the few belongings she'd accumulated, Amber wasn't sure she believed her own words. "You're leaving." She turned to find Steve standing in the doorway of his study. He wasn't wearing his usual sharp suit, just slacks and a simple button-down, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked younger somehow, less burdened. "My contract was temporary," Amber said, keeping her voice steady. "Mitchell is doing so well now. She doesn't need—" "She needs you," Steve interrupted quietly. "We both do." Amber's throat tightened. "You're doing fine on your own now. Better than fine. You're being the father she deserves. Because you showed me how." "No," Amber said gently. "You learned because you chose to. That was all you, Steve." He crossed the foyer, stopping a few feet away, maintaining the respectful distance he'd always kept. "At least say goodbye to her, Bum," he said. "She's in the garden." Amber found Mitchell exactly where Steve had said, sitting on the stone bench beneath the oak tree, surrounded by paper cranes hanging from the branches like a flock of frozen birds. The girl was humming softly, the same lullaby Amber had sung that first night during the storm. "Mitchell?" The girl's head turned and her face lit up with a smile that made Amber's heart crack. "Amber, look!" Mitchell held up a paper crane she'd folded herself, crooked and imperfect, but undeniably beautiful. "I made one like you showed me." "It's perfect," Amber whispered, kneeling beside the bench. She needed to say the words, needed to explain that she was leaving, that this was goodbye, that— "Why is your suitcase by the stairs?" Amber froze. Mitchell's brown eyes, those eyes that had been so haunted and hollow when they first met, now looked at her with sharp clarity. "Are you going somewhere?" "Sweetheart, And then Mitchell understood. Her expression crumpled. The paper crane slipped from her fingers. "No," she whispered. Then louder with rising panic, "No!" She scrambled off the bench and grabbed Amber's hands with surprising strength. "Don't go, Amber." Her voice rang out across the garden, clear, certain, desperate. "Please don't go. You can't leave. You promised I was safe." Tears spilled down the girl's cheeks, and Amber's composure shattered completely. "Oh, sweetheart, I need you." "Bah!" Mitchell cried, her voice breaking on the words. "Daddy needs you too. We both need you. Please, Amber, please." "Mitchell." Steve's voice came from behind them, gentle but firm. He crossed the garden and knelt beside his daughter, placing a hand on her trembling shoulder. "It's okay, baby," he said softly. "Breathe." But Mitchell shook her head violently. "She can't go. Tell her she can't go." Steve's eyes met Amber's over his daughter's head. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Steve said very quietly, "I can't tell her that, sweetheart. That's her choice to make." It was the most selfless thing Amber had ever heard him say. He could have commanded, could have offered more money, made promises, used his power to convince her. But instead, he was giving her freedom, trusting her to choose. Amber looked at Mitchell, this beautiful, brave girl who'd found her voice again. She looked at Steve, this complicated man who'd learned to love without controlling. She looked at the paper cranes hanging in the tree, the music box on the window ledge, the garden where laughter now lived. And she realized something she'd been trying not to admit for weeks. She didn't want to leave. Not because she was needed, but because somewhere along the way this had stopped being a job. It had become home. What if, Amber said slowly, I stayed, not as the maid, just as Amber? Mitchell's tear-stained face transformed with hope. Really? Amber looked at Steve. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerable, hopeful, and completely open. Really? Amber whispered. Mitchell launched herself into Amber's arms with such force they both nearly toppled over. You're staying! You're staying! The girl's laughter bubbled up, bright and joyful and so beautifully alive. Steve stood slowly, and when Amber looked up at him, she saw tears tracking silently down his face. Thank you, he mouthed. Amber nodded, holding Mitchell close, feeling the girl's heartbeat against her own. And in that moment, standing in the garden beneath paper cranes and autumn sunlight, the last piece of the Wallace mansion's broken heart clicked into place. 3 months later, the mansion hummed with sound now. Mitchell's laughter as she and Amber baked cookies in the kitchen, flour dusting their aprons. Steve's voice reading bedtime stories, doing silly character voices that made his daughter giggle. Music playing softly through the halls, not just the lonely music box, but real songs chosen with joy. The staff no longer walked on eggshells. They smiled. They laughed. The house that had been a prison of memory had become something else entirely. A home where healing lived, where love grew without conditions, where a mafia boss learned that true strength wasn't control, it was surrender, where a broken child found her voice, and where a maid with secrets of her own discovered that sometimes the people you save end up saving you right back. One evening, as Amber tucked Mitchell into bed, the girl looked up at her with sleepy eyes. Amber? Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you stayed. Amber smoothed the hair back from Mitchell's forehead, her heart full to bursting. So am I, baby. So am I. In the doorway, Steve watched them with quiet gratitude. His daughter was whole, his home was full, and the quiet miracle was complete. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in money, it's measured in moments like these, in laughter that fills empty hallways, in love that asks for nothing but gives everything, in the sound of a child's voice, once lost, now found. What are you willing to give up to find what truly matters? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that healing is possible, that love transforms, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stay.